Hey, you're listening to Night Tide. Tonight I'll walk you through one of the quieter, more persistent questions in psychology. What it actually means to grow up. Not in the sense of acquiring a mortgage or managing a calendar, but in the sense of becoming someone. And whether that process, if you follow it honestly, asks you to give up something you can't afford to lose. Write in the comments what time it is for you right now or how your day went. There are genuinely thoughtful people in these comments, and reading what you leave there is one of the real pleasures of this project. If Night Tide is something you want to support, there's a link in the description. There is a question that sits underneath most serious thinking about adult psychology, and it rarely gets stated directly. The question is this: if becoming mature requires surrendering certain versions of yourself, the open version, the searching version, the one that hadn't yet learned what was expected, then what exactly arrives at the end of that process? Who is the person standing there, having done all the right developmental work? And is that person more themselves or less? Most of what we're taught about growing up doesn't take this question seriously. The standard picture is additive. You start with something raw and incomplete, and over time, through experience, through difficulty, through the slow accumulation of self-knowledge, you become more. More stable, more capable, more whole. The losses along the way are framed as necessary costs, the price of something genuinely gained. That picture isn't wrong exactly. It's incomplete in a way that matters, because the losses don't always feel like refinement. Sometimes they feel like subtraction. A range of feeling that used to be available goes quiet. A kind of curiosity that was once automatic requires effort, then requires effort you don't always have, then stops arriving. The questions you used to live inside, about who you are, what you want, whether the life you're building is the one you actually meant to build, start to feel less urgent. And then they stop feeling urgent at all. This is often when people say they've grown up. The philosophical tradition that takes this most seriously tends to describe human existence as something that cannot be reduced to function. Jean-Paul Sartre spent considerable energy arguing that the self is never a finished object, that existence precedes any fixed definition of what a person is, which means a human being is always, structurally, ahead of themselves, never fully caught up to a final form. Erik Erikson, working inside psychology rather than philosophy, described adult development as a series of genuine crises in the clinical sense, turning points where the self either expands or contracts depending on what it encounters and how it moves through that encounter. Neither of them described maturity as an arrival. Both described it as a practice that either continues or stops. What makes this more than an academic point is how quietly the stopping can happen. There's no announcement, no moment where a person decides, consciously, to stop asking certain questions or to start performing a version of themselves rather than living one. The process tends to be gradual and feels, from the inside, like settling, like the reasonable narrowing that comes after enough experience. You know what you value. You know how you work. You know what kind of person you are. And all of that can be true and still be a description of someone who has stopped growing. The psychoanalytic tradition, particularly the strain that runs through Donald Winnicott's work on the development of the self, identifies something it calls the false self, a structure the person builds in response to external demands that becomes, over time, more automatic than the original. The false self is adaptive. It knows how to behave in rooms,
It satisfies obligations and maintains relationships, and is largely indistinguishable from the outside from a mature, functional adult. What it cannot do is feel genuine, and the person living inside it often experiences this as a low-grade, persistent sense that something essential is missing, without being able to say what or when it disappeared. This is the paradox the episode will keep returning to. Growing up is real. The development is real. The expanded capacity for holding complexity, for sustaining commitment, for moving through difficulty without collapsing, these things are genuine, and they matter. And the process that produces them can, under the wrong conditions, also hollow something out. The question worth carrying through is whether those two outcomes, genuine development and genuine loss, are separable. Whether it's possible to grow into fuller adulthood without losing the parts of yourself that were still open, still forming, still capable of being surprised by their own existence. Or whether the price of the one is always, to some degree, the other. That question doesn't have a clean answer. What it has is pressure, and that pressure is worth sitting with. The word mature gets used as a compliment so routinely that it's easy to miss what the compliment is actually for. When someone is described as mature, in a workplace, in a family, in the quiet assessment one person makes of another, what is usually meant is that they have stopped being inconvenient. They don't press too hard on things that make others uncomfortable. They don't ask for more than can easily be given. They absorb difficulty without making it visible, and they adjust their needs to fit the available space. This is what earns the label. The claim worth pressing on is simple. That kind of adaptation and genuine psychological development are not the same process. They can run alongside each other. Sometimes they even produce similar-looking results, but they originate from entirely different places and lead, over time, to entirely different kinds of people. Adaptation in this sense is relational. It happens in response to specific pressures, specific people, specific environments, specific sets of expectations that carry social weight. A child who learns that expressing certain feelings produces withdrawal, silence, or punishment will adjust. The adjustment is intelligent. It reads the environment accurately and responds in a way that reduces cost. Over years, the adjustment becomes automatic, then invisible, then mistaken for character. The person who spent a decade learning not to need too much comes to experience themselves as someone who simply doesn't need much. The difference between suppressing a need and not having one is not always detectable from the inside. And by the time the distinction matters, it can be very difficult to recover. What that process produces, the reliable, low-maintenance, socially legible adult, is genuinely useful to the people around them. There's no cynicism required to say that. The usefulness is real. What is also real is that usefulness as a developmental goal is different from wholeness as a developmental goal. A person optimized for social utility has arrived somewhere. The question is whether that somewhere is where they were actually trying to go, or simply where the pressure was pointing. You have probably met people who are extraordinarily competent in every visible register. Organized, dependable, calm under pressure, excellent at what they do, and who carry, somewhere in the way they speak about themselves, an almost imperceptible flatness, as though the lights are on in every room they need to function in, and off in a few rooms they rarely mention. This isn't a failure of effort or intelligence. It tends to be the long result of having learned, very thoroughly, that certain rooms weren't safe to enter. The psychological cost of that thoroughness compounds. What begins as a reasonable boundary, this is not the place to bring that part of myself, can solidify into an inability to access that part of yourself anywhere. The containment that started as context-specific becomes structural. And structural containment doesn't feel like suppression. It feels like stability. It feels like knowing who you are. This is where the concept earns its difficulty, because stability is real and valuable. The person who has built genuine psychological stability, who has developed the capacity to tolerate frustration, to sustain commitment over time, to hold their sense of self under pressure, has built something meaningful. The problem is that this genuine stability and the frozen stability of someone who has stopped feeling certain things look almost identical from the outside. And they can feel identical from the inside for a long time until they don't. The distinction has something to do with what the stability costs. Genuine psychological settledness tends to allow for more contact, not less. More capacity to be moved by what is actually moving, more tolerance for uncertainty, more ability to remain present with people who are difficult or unpredictable. The other kind of stability, the adaptive kind, the kind that is really successful containment accumulated over decades, tends to narrow contact over time. The tolerance for ambiguity decreases. The range of acceptable emotional weather shrinks. What looks like maturity from the outside is, from the inside, a progressive reduction in surface area. Growing up, in the real sense, is supposed to expand what you can hold. When it contracts it instead, when what emerges is someone who has simply learned to want less, feel less, ask for less, it's worth asking what developmental process actually occurred. Whether the person who arrived is someone who developed or someone who adapted so completely that they have very little left to develop from. That question doesn't resolve quickly. It tends to surface in the middle of ordinary life, in moments that are hard to explain. A familiar competence that somehow feels empty. A version of your own name that sounds like someone else's. The strange distance between the life you're living and the sense that you were supposed to want it more than this. These aren't symptoms of failure. They're the pressure of what was set aside starting to make itself known again. There is a distinction that gets collapsed so routinely it has almost stopped being visible. The capacity to hold a feeling, to let it be present, to move through it without being destroyed by it, is not the same thing as the capacity to make a feeling stop. These are different mechanisms. They produce different people. And the confusion between them may be one of the most consequential errors in the long, informal education that most adults receive about how emotions are supposed to work. The problem is how this confusion gets installed. It doesn't arrive as a doctrine. Nobody sits a child down and explains that feelings are dangerous and should be eliminated. What happens is quieter and more effective. A feeling is expressed and the room changes. The adult withdraws or tightens or shifts the subject, or responds with something that makes it clear this level of emotional weather is not welcome here. The child adjusts. The adjustment is repeated across hundreds of small interactions, across years. And what accumulates is a working theory about what feelings are for. The theory, stated plainly, is that feelings are obstacles to be removed, rather than information to be processed. And once that theory is in place, it runs automatically, long after the original conditions that produced it have disappeared. What makes this worth examining carefully is where it leads, because the destination is not neutral. When a feeling is suppressed, when the actual goal is to stop having it rather than to move through it, the feeling doesn't disappear. The energy that organized around it has to go somewhere. It tends to show up laterally, in places that seem unrelated to the original material. In a chronic low-level irritability that has no apparent cause. In physical tension that accumulates without a clear source. In a relationship pattern that repeats across different contexts with different people, as though the situation keeps finding you regardless of what you do. The feeling that was efficiently eliminated from awareness has not been processed. It has been relocated.
Genuine containment works differently.
The person who has developed the actual capacity to hold emotion is not someone who has learned to feel less. They are someone who has learned to feel without being governed. The feeling arrives, and they are present to it, aware of it, able to track it, capable of deciding what to do with it, rather than simply being driven by its pressure. This requires something that suppression never builds, which is a kind of structural intimacy with your own inner states. You have to be able to tolerate their presence long enough to understand them. A person who has spent years training themselves to eliminate feelings quickly has, by that training, reduced their capacity to do this. The tolerance for staying inside difficult emotional experience decreases with disuse, the same way any capacity decreases with disuse. And so, the very practice that was meant to produce a functional, stable adult produces instead someone whose range of emotional access has narrowed significantly, who experiences strong feeling primarily as threat, and whose first response to their own interior life is to shut it down. Think about what that means over time. Every year of this practice is another year in which the territory of inner life becomes slightly smaller, slightly less familiar, slightly more associated with danger rather than information. By the time a person is 40 or 50 and has been efficiently suppressing emotional experience since childhood, the interior has become genuinely foreign. They may describe themselves as not particularly emotional, as someone who simply processes things quickly and moves on. The description can feel accurate. What it doesn't capture is the difference between processing and foreclosing. And here is where the developmental cost becomes clearest. The capacity to grow, psychologically, relationally, in terms of what you can hold and understand about yourself and others, depends on access to your own experience. You cannot integrate what you cannot feel. You cannot learn from an emotional response you've already eliminated before examining it. The data that genuine emotional experience provides about what matters to you, where your actual values live, what you are moving toward or away from and why, that data becomes unavailable when the mechanism for receiving it has been systematically deactivated. So what gets called emotional maturity in a person who has perfected suppression is, functionally, a kind of emotional illiteracy that has been made comfortable. They have learned to be stable in the way a room is stable when all the windows have been sealed. Nothing disturbs the atmosphere, the temperature is controlled, and over time, the air goes stale in ways that take a while to notice and longer to trace back to the ceiling. This is one of the specific ways in which what culture rewards as maturity and what genuine psychological development require can move in opposite directions. The socially legible, mature adult has their emotional life under control, meaning it does not become visible in inconvenient ways, meaning it does not disrupt the functioning of the rooms they're responsible for. That legibility is real and has genuine social value. What it doesn't guarantee, what it actively works against in some cases, is the kind of interior aliveness that psychological development actually requires as its raw material.
The cost of that is personal in a way that's hard to articulate. It tends to feel not like suffering, but like a mild, persistent absence. A flatness in experience that is hard to name, because naming it would require access to the contrast, and the contrast has been unavailable for so long, it is no longer easy to remember. You can go a long time carrying that absence without identifying it as loss. You can call it stability. You can call it knowing yourself. You can call it having grown up. And all of those descriptions might even feel accurate until something breaks the surface. Some experience, some relationship, some unguarded moment. And for a second,
The difference between containment and suppression becomes viscerally clear, in a way that is very difficult to unfeel once you've felt it. The self you carry into adult life was not waiting inside you to be uncovered. It was assembled, across years, under conditions you didn't choose, in response to pressures that didn't always have your best interests as their primary concern. That's a difficult thing to sit with, because it runs against one of the more comfortable ideas about personal identity. The idea that who you are is fundamentally yours, original, continuous, traceable back to something essential. The reality is more procedural than that, and more fragile. Construction is the right word for what happens, not discovery, not emergence in the way a photograph develops in a darkroom, the image always latent, always there, simply requiring the right conditions to appear. What actually occurs is more like building under constraint, with materials that arrive unevenly, in forms that don't always fit together, according to blueprints drawn up by people whose own understanding of what a self should look like was itself borrowed and partly wrong. The resulting structure can be functional, can even feel solid, without being particularly accurate to anything the person might have chosen if the conditions of construction had been different. This matters because the structure keeps being mistaken for a given. Once a self has been assembled with enough internal coherence to pass as stable, it tends to acquire the quality of inevitability. The patterns of thought, the defaults in relationship, the characteristic ways of responding to difficulty or desire, these stop feeling like habits that were learned and start feeling like facts about who you are. And there is something deeply human in that transition. Treating your own character as fixed reduces the cognitive load of ongoing self-examination. It allows you to operate. The problem is that it also makes the assembly invisible, and invisible construction is construction that cannot be revised.
Think about the mechanism for a moment. A child learns, through the particular texture of their specific relationships, which version of themselves is welcome, which needs are safe to express, which feelings receive recognition, which qualities draw warmth, and which draw withdrawal or criticism. The responses aren't neutral information, they are formative. The self that gets constructed is, in significant part, the self that was workable in that specific environment, the one that minimized cost and maximized the possibility of being received by the people who mattered most. This is not pathology. This is ordinary developmental adaptation. What it means, though, is that the self is shaped at least as much by what the environment could tolerate as by what the person actually was. A child who is told, repeatedly and in various registers, that their intensity is too much will not simply learn to modulate their intensity in certain contexts. Over enough time, they will learn to experience their own intensity as a problem, as something that belongs to a less developed version of themselves, something to be grown out of. The quality doesn't disappear, but it gets rooted underground, redefined from asset to liability. And the person who arrives at adulthood may carry a genuine belief that they are someone who doesn't have that quality, when what is actually true is that they have it fully and have learned to treat it as a flaw. This is one of the specific ways the construction goes wrong without anyone intending it to. The person builds a self that is legible and functional and approved. And somewhere in that process, a quality that was originally theirs, genuinely, characteristically, specifically theirs, gets built around rather than built with. The resulting structure is stable, it works, it earns the label of maturity in most of the social contexts that apply the label. What it contains, somewhere in its load-bearing walls, is an absence where something real used to be. Where this breaks down most visibly
is in the experience of sustained, close relationship. Not the performed version of relationship, the version managed from behind the usual presentation, but genuine, sustained contact with another person who is paying close enough attention to notice the gap between what is presented and what is actually there. That kind of contact has a way of finding the seams in the construction. Not aggressively, necessarily, just by being present in a way that the usual architecture wasn't designed for. The person who has never examined their own construction often experiences this as being seen wrongly, as being misunderstood by someone who is projecting onto them things that aren't there. Sometimes that's true, and sometimes what is being seen is exactly what is there, behind the wall that was built so early and so thoroughly that it no longer registers as a wall. The human cost of unexamined construction accumulates in a particular way. It tends to be experienced less as suffering than as a recurring low-level bewilderment, a sense that life keeps presenting situations that feel somehow off-register, that certain experiences that should feel like yours feel slightly borrowed, that the satisfaction expected from things achieved doesn't quite arrive in the form anticipated. These are not dramatic symptoms. They don't announce themselves as psychological facts to be examined. They surface in ordinary moments as a faint, persistent wrongness. And they are, often enough, the pressure of a self that was built according to someone else's specifications, trying to make itself known. The partial resolution available here is not reassuring in the usual sense. Recognizing that the self was constructed under external pressure doesn't undo the construction. It doesn't immediately reveal what would have been built differently or produce instant access to the qualities that got rooted around. What it does is shift the relationship to the structure from identification to observation. The self that was assembled stops being simply what you are and becomes something you can examine with curiosity, with patience, with the recognition that some of what feels most essentially yours may be borrowed, and some of what feels foreign may be original. That shift doesn't resolve anything quickly, but it's the only starting point from which the structure can be worked with rather than merely inhabited. And working with it is exactly what remains difficult, because the tools available for that work are themselves part of the construction. There is a version of adulthood that looks, from the outside, like the fullest expression of what growing up means. The person keeps their commitments, they show up reliably, they carry what is asked of them without visible complaint. They have organized their life around the needs of others, children, partners, employers, aging parents, and they do this consistently across years with what appears to be both competence and acceptance. This is usually what people mean when they describe someone as responsible. And responsibility, the story goes, is the mark of someone who has genuinely arrived at maturity.
What the story skips is the question of who is doing the carrying. When obligation becomes identity, not a practice the person engages in, but the primary structure through which they understand themselves, something happens to the person inside the role. The self that existed before the role was fully assumed, the one with its own particular desires, its own unfinished questions, its own direction of wanting, starts to lose definition. Gradually, without a single moment that could be named. What accumulates is not the richness of a life organized around meaning, but a kind of efficient vacancy. The person functions, they function well, and increasingly there is less and less of them present in the functioning. This is one of the specific ways you can disappear into what you've built. Responsibility taken up as a practice is something different. It exists within a life that also contains the person who is practicing it. The obligation is real, the commitment is real, the cost is real, and the person who carries it retains their own interior weight alongside it. They are someone who has responsibilities
rather than someone who is their responsibilities. That distinction is subtle, and it is not subtle at all. The person who has fully collapsed into their role has no remainder. Ask them what they want for themselves, independently of what anyone needs from them, and there is often a long pause that is not considered silence. It is the sound of a question that has not been asked in a long time, landing on ground that has grown unfamiliar. The mechanism by which this happens is worth examining, because it is rarely violent. Nobody decides to erase themselves in exchange for the satisfactions of obligation. What tends to occur is slower. The role begins as something added, a new responsibility taken on, a commitment made. And at first, it coexists with everything else. But roles have gravity. They expand into available space. They generate further obligations, further expectations, further identifications. And at some point, the question of what the person wants, separate from what the role requires, starts to feel slightly illegitimate, slightly self-indulgent, slightly adolescent, slightly incompatible with the seriousness of adult life as it has come to be understood. And here is where it shades into something genuinely costly. The feeling that your own desires are a form of immaturity is not a neutral belief to carry. It doesn't simply suppress the desires, it reframes them as something to be grown past. To want something for yourself, to maintain an interior life that is yours rather than organized around the demands of function, starts to feel like a failure of development rather than a feature of it. The person doesn't just lose access to their desires, they lose the sense that having them is legitimate. What makes this particularly hard to examine is that the resulting life can look genuinely good. The children are cared for, the work gets done, the household runs. The people in this person's orbit are, by most measures, well served by the arrangement. The cost is borne almost entirely internally, in the slowly shrinking territory of a self that is no longer being inhabited. And because the external presentation is coherent, because it passes every visible test of what adult life is supposed to look like, there is almost no social feedback that something is being lost. The loss doesn't register as loss in any language the surrounding world speaks fluently. Responsibility that is healthy keeps pointing back toward the person practicing it. It has direction, meaning it connects to something the person actually values. Values in the specific sense of having chosen, having examined, having found genuinely worth caring about, rather than simply inherited as obvious. When that connection exists, obligation can be sustained across years without consuming the one who carries it, because the carrying is in service of something that also serves them. When the connection has been severed, when the responsibility floats free of any living relationship to what the person actually cares about, it becomes weight without orientation. The person keeps moving because stopping would require them to feel something they have not allowed themselves to feel in a long time. You can see this in how people respond to the prospect of time that is genuinely unstructured, genuinely theirs. For someone who has maintained an inner life alongside their obligations, unstructured time has content, direction, pull, the pressure of things they actually want to do or think about or experience. For someone who has fully become their role, the same unstructured time can produce something closer to anxiety. Not because they are lazy or ungrateful, but because the self that would inhabit that time has been so consistently organized around external requirement that it has lost the habit of having its own direction. The emptiness isn't restful. It is disorienting in a way that is hard to account for, because it sits where something is supposed to be. This doesn't resolve cleanly. Recognizing that you have become your obligations doesn't immediately restore what was present before the collapse. The desires that were gradually delegitimized don't simply resurface once the question is asked again. What has been suppressed through years of redefinition as immature requires something more patient than recognition to recover. And in the meantime, the obligations remain real. The children still need care. The work is still there. The commitments don't pause while the interior reorganizes. So the person is left holding both the weight of the role and the beginning awareness of what the role has cost, without any obvious point at which the two can be cleanly separated. That is the particular bind at the center of this kind of self-erasure. It is not that the responsibility was wrong to take on. It is that somewhere in the process of taking it on, the person stopped being someone who chose it and became someone who simply was it. And the distance between those two positions, which can look so small from the outside, turns out to be the distance between a life that is lived and a life that is merely administered.
The fear of being seen as immature is one of the quieter engines of adult behavior. Quiet because it rarely announces itself as fear. It operates more like a background pressure, a steady calibration of what can be expressed, what can be admitted, what can be shown, and what must be managed, into a form that reads as settled. Most people who are shaped by this pressure would not describe themselves as afraid. They would describe themselves as having learned how things work, and that is precisely what makes it difficult to examine. The social punishment for apparent immaturity is real, and it accumulates early. A child who cries too often in the wrong context, who asks questions that seem to miss what everyone else has already understood, who expresses uncertainty when certainty is expected, that child receives information. Repeated information across many sources, delivered sometimes harshly, and sometimes with a kind of gentle, disappointed patience that is, in its own way, harder to metabolize. The information is consistent in its core content. This quality you are showing, right now, is a version of yourself you are supposed to be moving past. Growth is directional. The direction is away from what you are currently doing. What this does to honesty is worth sitting with. The cost is not simply that the child learns to perform certainty they don't have. That would be manageable, a social skill, a form of tact. What happens is more structural. The person learns to distrust their own uncertainty as a psychological fact. Uncertainty stops being experienced as genuine epistemic condition, as the honest state of not yet knowing, and starts being experienced as a symptom of insufficiency. To not know becomes something to overcome, rather than something to report accurately. And the person who has fully internalized this framework will suppress genuine uncertainty even in their own private thinking, not only in their public presentation, because the habit of treating it as shameful runs that deep. Genuine developmental movement requires the capacity to not know. That is not a comfort offered to make uncertainty feel better. It is a description of how change actually works. A person who cannot tolerate their own uncertainty cannot examine themselves honestly, because honest self-examination almost always produces uncertainty before it produces clarity. The questions worth asking don't yield clean answers on first contact. They require sitting inside the not knowing long enough for something more accurate to become visible. Someone who has learned that not knowing is a mark of insufficient development will cut the process short, will move toward a conclusion before the examination is complete, because staying in the uncertainty feels like evidence of a failure they have been trained to avoid. The performance that fills in for honest development has its own particular texture. You can feel it sometimes in conversations where someone is describing their life. There is fluency, coherence, the right kind of self-awareness signaled at the right intervals. The person knows how an examined life is supposed to sound, and they produce that sound with real skill. What is absent is the slight roughness that attends genuine uncertainty.
The moment where the person pauses because they actually don't know what they think, where they say something and then qualify it because the qualification is actually necessary, where the account breaks down slightly at the edges because real experience doesn't fully cohere. Performance is too smooth, and its smoothness is evidence of something that isn't there.
There is a particular form this takes when you are trying to understand yourself honestly. You find that the vocabulary for admitted uncertainty feels juvenile. Words like, "I don't know what I want," or "I'm still working out what I think about this," or "I haven't figured that out." These carry a social register that has been permanently associated with youth, and they do so in a way that makes deploying them feel like a form of self-diminishment, even in private. The person who has spent years performing maturity has often lost access to the language of honest developmental confusion, not because the confusion is gone, but because the language for it has been made to feel beneath them. So they substitute. They reach for conclusions they haven't fully earned, for positions that are slightly more resolved than their actual thinking, for the confident account of themselves that the social situation is asking for. And, after they've done this enough times, the substitution starts to feel like the real thing. The performance and the psychology begin to overlap. It becomes genuinely difficult to locate the difference between what you actually believe about yourself and what you have been presenting, because the presentation has been consistent for so long that the gap between them has filled in. This is the specific bind that the fear of appearing immature creates, and it is different from ordinary self-deception in its mechanism. Ordinary self-deception protects against pain. This version protects against social cost. It is organized not around avoiding the awareness of something painful, but around avoiding the appearance of a quality that is socially penalized. The result is a person whose relationship to their own development is partly organized around what that development must not look like. And since it must not look like uncertainty, question, or unresolved searching, those are exactly the things that get systematically excluded from the process. What grows in their place is a kind of ambient authority, the sense that the person has things worked out, that they operate from a settled position, that they are not among those who are still figuring it out. This can feel like stability. It can be genuinely experienced as stability. The difference between someone who has actually reached a provisional resting point through real examination and someone who has constructed the appearance of that resting point through systematic avoidance is not immediately visible, even from the inside. You would need access to what the person does with questions that destabilize their settled account, whether they engage the questions or find ways to redirect them, whether they allow the discomfort or produce explanations that dissolve it too cleanly. The long consequence of this runs in a direction that is hard to reverse once it has accumulated enough distance. Each year in which genuine uncertainty is suppressed in favor of performance is a year in which the capacity for honest self-examination gets slightly less exercise. The muscle, if you want to call it that, doesn't strengthen through disuse, and the disuse is organized, deliberate, driven by a social logic that has been fully internalized. The person who arrives at 40, having performed maturity for 20 years, has not developed nothing in that time. They have developed real competence, real relational capacity, real knowledge of how to operate in the world. What they may have severely underdeveloped is the capacity to sit with their own not knowing long enough to find out something true. And by that point, the deficit is old enough to feel like character.
Grief is not what interrupts adult life. It is one of the processes through which adult life actually advances. That claim is worth slowing down for, because the common understanding runs in the opposite direction. Grief is typically framed as a response to loss, something that happens to you,
that you move through, that you eventually recover from, so that ordinary functioning can resume. The recovery is the point. The grief is the obstacle between where you were and where you are supposed to get back to. In this framing, the capacity to grieve well means, essentially, the capacity to finish grieving efficiently, to complete the passage and return to the surface without being pulled under. What that framing misses is what the grieving is actually doing. Every real developmental movement requires surrendering something that was previously real. This is not metaphor. It describes an actual psychological transaction. When a person genuinely accepts that certain possibilities are closed, that a particular version of their life is no longer available, that something they held with real investment is gone, what takes place in them is not simply subtraction. The internal space previously organized around that thing is released. And what becomes possible in the release, the reorientation, the reorganization of what matters, the shift in how the person moves through their own life, is what development is actually made of. The grief and the growth are not sequential. They are the same process operating at different levels simultaneously. A child learns this before they have words for it. The first serious confrontation with the non-negotiability of reality, that wanting something very badly does not produce it, that love does not prevent loss, that the world maintains its structure regardless of how much pressure is applied, is, in miniature, the same reckoning that continues through every major transition of an adult life. What changes is the scale of what must be surrendered and the sophistication required to process the surrender without either collapsing into it or cutting it short. Think of a person at the threshold of what they recognize as their last real chance at something. A career path, a relationship structure, a particular image of the life they were going to have. The recognition that the chance is genuinely closing, that this is not a temporary delay, but a permanent foreclosure, produces something that often gets managed immediately. The person finds ways to reframe it, to identify what was unrealistic about the original desire, to produce a narrative in which the loss is actually fine, actually expected, actually less of a loss than it appeared. This is extremely common, and it is not the same as grieving. What the reframe does is preserve the person from having to fully feel the weight of what is being surrendered. The grief, in its actual form, would require sitting with the reality that something genuinely wanted is genuinely gone. And doing that without converting the feeling into something more manageable before it has finished being what it is. The psychology of this matters because incompletely processed loss doesn't remain neutral. It stays organized around the thing that was not fully mourned. The person who never genuinely grieved the foreclosed possibility continues to carry it in a particular way, in ongoing, low-level bitterness, in a resistance to fully investing in what is actually available, in a tendency to return to the same formulations about how things might have been. The weight of the unmourned thing doesn't decrease over time. Often it increases because everything that builds up around it has to be organized in relation to it without acknowledging it directly. Genuine mourning, the kind that is actually completed rather than managed into dormancy, requires something that most developmental models don't fully describe. It requires the person to allow the full subjective reality of the loss to be present without immediately acting on it, explaining it, or converting it into something else. This is not passive, it is an active capacity. The person who has developed it can hold the weight of what is gone without needing to either produce it as a performance of feeling or suppress it in the name of functioning. They can remain in contact with the loss long enough for the internal reorganization to occur, which is the part that actually constitutes development. What tends to develop in people who consistently skip this process is not, as it might appear, resilience. Resilience is the capacity to absorb difficulty and continue moving with integrity. What develops instead is a form of emotional efficiency that looks like resilience from the outside. The person keeps going. They don't visibly break down. They demonstrate a kind of forward momentum that others often admire. But the internal architecture supporting that forward momentum is organized around avoidance rather than integration. Each unprocessed loss adds another structure that must be rooted around. The person's inner life becomes increasingly crowded with the shapes of things that were never fully acknowledged, and the navigation required to keep moving while keeping those shapes unexamined consumes resources that would otherwise be available for something else. Over time, you can feel this in the quality of a person's engagement with the present. When very little has been fully mourned, the present keeps being used to manage the past. New situations are processed partly through the lens of old losses that were never completed. There is a slight lag, a slight overlay, a way in which current experience carries the residue of accumulated, not grief. The person is never quite fully present in what is actually happening because some of their attention is always occupied by the maintenance of avoidance.
What mourning restores, when it is allowed to complete, is not happiness in any simple sense. It is something closer to availability, the capacity to be genuinely present to what is now, to bring the full weight of one's investment to what is actually here, rather than to what was lost or what might have been. The reorientation that follows genuine grief is real, and it costs something real. A person who has actually grieved a foreclosed possibility is different afterward, in ways that are sometimes disorienting even to them. The certainty that was previously organized around the lost thing has to be rebuilt from a different foundation. That rebuilding is the work that genuine development is made of. This is why the capacity to grieve and the capacity to grow are not merely related. They are, at a structural level, expressions of the same underlying capacity. The ability to remain in genuine contact with what is real, even when what is real includes loss, foreclosure, and the permanent unavailability of something that mattered. A person who cannot tolerate genuine mourning cannot fully accept reality as it is, which means they cannot orient themselves accurately within it, which means that whatever movement they make forward carries within it an unexamined distortion, the shape of what they could not bring themselves to acknowledge. The developmental cost accumulates slowly and rarely presents as obviously related to grief. It presents as a kind of low-grade distance from life, from others, from the sense that what is available is genuinely worth inhabiting. And because the distance is chronic rather than acute, it tends not to be identified as loss at all. It reads as temperament, as personality, as a sober assessment of what adulthood actually offers. The connection back to what was never mourned remains invisible. What is left is a person who is, in some functional sense, entirely present, and in another, more essential sense, still elsewhere. There is a particular illusion that stagnation offers, and it is one of the most convincing available to an adult life. The illusion is this, that the absence of turbulence means you have arrived somewhere, that the feeling of having settled is evidence of genuine settlement, that when the restlessness quiets and the questions become less urgent and the days begin to carry a certain predictable weight, something has been accomplished. The difficult early work of becoming a person is behind you, and what you are living now is the reward.
The rule operates with remarkable consistency. In adult life, stability is valued above almost everything else. People seek it, protect it, measure their progress by how much of it they have accumulated. And so when the internal experience of a person begins to resemble stability, when the searching feels finished, when the self feels more or less legible to itself, when the landscape of daily life stops producing genuine surprise, the natural interpretation is that something has been achieved. You have become, in some real sense, the settled version of yourself that the earlier turbulence was moving toward. The tension embedded in this is that stagnation and arrival produce an identical interior feeling. There is no phenomenological difference from the inside between a person who has genuinely reached a resting point through real integration and a person who has simply stopped. Both feel quiet. Both feel like rest. The quietness in the first case is earned. It holds something. It is full. And the quietness in the second case is empty in a way that takes years to become detectable. But at the moment of experience, they feel the same. This is not a small problem. It is a nearly total failure of introspection as a guide. What makes this particularly difficult is that stagnation does not arrive as a crisis. Crisis, paradoxically, is easier to work with. It announces itself. It creates pressure toward examination. It makes it impossible to maintain the fiction that nothing significant is happening. Stagnation arrives as relief. The questions that were once genuinely alive, about what you want, about whether your life is the one you meant to build, about who you are when the functional demands are removed, gradually stop pressing. They don't get answered. They stop being asked. And because the stopping feels like resolution, it receives no scrutiny. The mechanism by which this happens is gradual enough that it resists any single moment of noticing. A person becomes more efficient at managing their interior life, better at redirecting attention, better at producing satisfying explanations for why things are the way they are, better at converting potential disturbance into familiar categories. Each time a question that could have opened something is instead managed into dormancy, the threshold for what counts as a genuine question rises slightly. Eventually, the threshold is high enough that most of what would have been genuinely disturbing at 35 passes at 50 without registering as disturbing at all. This is the process that, from the outside and from the inside, looks like the development of equanimity. Equanimity is real. The hardening of the self against disturbance is also real. You cannot distinguish them by looking at the surface of how a person moves through their days. The calm, the competence, the absence of visible struggle. What you would need to see is what the person does when something genuinely new arrives. Not new in the sense of unfamiliar task or changed circumstance, but new in the sense of actually destabilizing. A question that doesn't fit the existing framework, a feeling that exceeds the categories available for processing it, a confrontation with something about themselves that the settled account doesn't accommodate. The genuinely integrated person can receive this. The stagnated person, who has been experiencing themselves as settled, cannot, and the cannot is not experienced as inability. It is experienced as the new thing being wrong, being excessive, being something the person has wisely moved past. This is where the course becomes structural. Psychological development beyond a certain point requires genuine contact with what is actually happening inside you. The full range of it, including the material that the competent, functional self has organized itself around avoiding. A person who has been in a long period of apparent stability has often developed sophisticated systems for not having that contact. The systems work extremely well. They are not maintained through effort anymore. They are automatic, invisible, experienced as simply how the person is.
The internal architecture has been built to root around certain territories, and the routing is so complete that the person often doesn't know the territories exist. The cost is paid in narrowing. Fewer questions, as the skeleton puts it, and shorter imaginative reach, and a decreasing tolerance for ambiguity, not because ambiguity has been resolved, but because the system for routing around it has become comprehensive enough that ambiguity rarely reaches the level of conscious experience anymore. The person's world, understood from the inside, becomes gradually more legible, more manageable, more organized according to expectations that are met with satisfying regularity. This can feel like understanding. It can feel like the hard-won clarity of someone who has genuinely learned a great deal about how things work. The difference between that and a world that has been systematically simplified to match what the self can tolerate is rarely examined, because the examination would require precisely the kind of genuine contact with uncertainty that the simplification was built to prevent. What is lost in the narrowing is not always dramatic. It doesn't usually announce itself as loss. It shows up as a slight flattening of response, the way things that once produced real curiosity now produce competent recognition. The way new people are efficiently categorized rather than genuinely encountered. The way situations that once held real uncertainty are processed through frameworks that produce the right answer quickly, reliably, without the uncomfortable pause of actual not knowing. The efficiency is real. Something else, harder to name, has been exchanged for it. There is a particular quality that can be felt in people who have been in genuine developmental movement, even when that movement is difficult, even when it produces more uncertainty than resolution. There is a kind of aliveness in how they contact what is in front of them. The opposite of that aliveness is not peace. It is a very practiced, very convincing, very comfortable absence that has learned to present itself as a rival. What lives underground in a person does not stay still. It doesn't remain where it was placed, quiet, contained, waiting politely to be addressed at some later and more convenient time. It moves, not visibly, not dramatically, but with a consistency that accumulates into something undeniable over years. The feelings that were never processed, the perceptions of the self that were too uncomfortable to examine, the desires that had no acceptable place in the life that was being constructed, none of this material simply dissolves because it was not given attention. It reorganizes itself into pressure, and pressure, sustained over long enough a period, finds expression whether or not expression was invited.
This is one of the more precise things that depth psychology ever produced as an insight. That the unconscious is not a passive storage space. It is active. The material that has been pushed out of awareness continues to work on behavior, on patterns of response, on what a person finds themselves drawn toward and repelled by, often in ways that bear no obvious relationship to the original source. The person who never allowed themselves to feel the full weight of a particular rage finds themselves, years later, with a body that is chronically tense, with a way of speaking that is slightly too controlled, with a threshold for conflict so carefully maintained that it produces its own particular kind of withdrawal. The connection between what was buried and what is now visible in the person's life is real. But it is rarely legible as a connection without something that deliberately traces the line. What this means for the question of growing up is that the project of becoming a functioning adult, of managing what needs to be managed, of presenting a capable and organized self to the world, can proceed with apparent success while the underground life becomes increasingly active. The two things are not in opposition from the outside. A person can be genuinely effective in their work, genuinely responsible in their relationships, genuinely composed in how they carry themselves, and simultaneously be living with an interior whose actual contents have not been examined in a decade.
The functionality and the underground pressure coexist without necessarily producing any visible contradiction until the pressure exceeds the system's capacity to contain it. The symptoms that emerge are rarely identified as symptoms at all in the early stages. They look like personality. They look like preference. They look like the reasonably stable characteristics of someone who knows themselves fairly well. You find yourself avoiding certain kinds of conversations without quite knowing why. A particular type of situation produces a response that is slightly larger than the situation seems to warrant, and the slight excess is quickly explained away. Stress, tiredness, the other person's unreasonableness. The same conflict appears in different relationships with different people and is consistently attributed to the specific qualities of those specific people, never to the structural pattern that runs through all of them. A recurring dream carries images that resist interpretation and are therefore set aside. The territory of what a person considers themselves capable of quietly contracts, and the contraction is not experienced as loss, it is experienced as self-knowledge, as realism, as having learned from experience what they are and are not suited for.
The mechanism at work is straightforward enough in description, but difficult to interrupt in practice. What cannot be acknowledged consciously must find alternative routes into the life. The feelings that were not processed in real time continue to press for expression, and when the direct route is closed, they find indirect ones. The person who buried their grief about a particular foreclosed possibility develops a persistent, low-level irritability with their current circumstances that they cannot quite explain. The person who could not permit themselves to acknowledge their own ambition begins to experience a generalized sense of dissatisfaction that attaches to whatever is nearest, the relationship, the work, the city they live in, without ever locating its actual source. The indirect expression is real. The connection to what is underground remains hidden. Over years, this produces a particular quality of estrangement from oneself. A person begins to notice that their responses to things are slightly opaque to them, that they feel things without understanding quite why, or that they act in ways that, observed from a slight distance, they would not have predicted or chosen. This is not the experience of someone who is psychologically, catastrophically disorganized. It is the ordinary, unremarkable experience of someone whose underground life has been growing in influence, while the conscious, presented self has remained committed to the account of themselves that was established earlier. The account and the interior have drifted. The gap between them is felt as a vague wrongness, a sense that something doesn't quite fit, that the life they are living and the person they seem to be from the outside and the person they privately experience themselves as are not quite the same entity. What makes this relevant to the question of what it means to grow up is that this estrangement is not a detour from adult life. The process that produces it is not a failure of character or a lack of effort. It is the predictable result of the way most people are shaped, by an environment that consistently rewards the management of inner experience over the genuine engagement with it, that treats the composed and functional presentation as the actual goal, rather than as a byproduct of genuine integration. A person who followed those instructions faithfully, who learned to manage well and present competently and keep the difficult material at bay, has not done something wrong. They have done something entirely reasonable, given the consistent pressure of the environment they were shaped in. The cost of it lands anyway. Because the underground does not negotiate. It does not accept the terms by which the composed self has organized things. It continues its work without requiring permission, without announcing what it is doing, without providing legible feedback, until the feedback arrives in forms that are impossible to continue ignoring. At that point,
which might come as a crisis or as a long, grinding accumulation of low-level symptoms or as a sudden confrontation with how narrow the life has become. The choice is to begin the work of examination or to invest more heavily in the systems that have been keeping the underground contained. And the investment in containment at that stage is enormous. It takes up the kind of energy that would otherwise be available for everything else. There is something particular about examining this late, when the underground life has been active for a long time and the surface life has been organized around not seeing it. The examination doesn't feel like recovery. It feels, initially, like disorientation, like discovering that what seemed like solid ground was constructed over something that was always in motion. The solidity was real in its way. The construction was genuine and functional, and in many respects served the person well. What it could not do was substitute for the actual relationship with what was moving underneath. That relationship was always going to be required. The only variable was how long it would be deferred and what would accumulate in the deferral. There is a distinction that adult life almost never stops to examine, and its neglect has real consequences. The distinction is between a person who has become genuinely settled, whose stability holds because something real was integrated, something difficult was moved through, something formerly reactive was metabolized into actual ground, and a person who has simply reached the point where change is no longer tolerable. From any meaningful distance, these two people look the same. They present the same surface. They carry themselves with comparable steadiness. The difference is invisible in the ordinary transactions of daily life, and it is largely invisible to the people who hold it because the experience of both states, from the inside, is the experience of being someone who knows where they stand.
The distinction matters because what we typically call stability, in adult psychology, in the way people speak about someone who has clearly grown into themselves, is honored almost without qualification. Stability is treated as an end point, a destination reached through the right kind of effort and experience. When someone is described as settled in who they are, the description carries approval, the sense that something was accomplished. The problem is that the concept absorbs two entirely different internal realities and returns only one word for both of them. Rigidity is stability that has lost its capacity to flex. A genuinely stable structure can receive pressure and redistribute it. A rigid structure cannot receive pressure at all. It can only hold or break. The difference is not in how the structure appears when nothing is pressing against it. The difference appears only when something does. A person whose stability is genuine can be genuinely surprised, genuinely destabilized by something new, and return, not because nothing happened, but because there was enough ground beneath them to absorb the impact. A person whose stability is rigidity cannot be genuinely surprised without something defensive activating. The new thing is managed, rerouted, explained away, or classified as a threat. The system remains intact. The person experiences this as composure. Someone who spent years treating every decision as provisional, reconsidering everything constantly, never quite committing to the ground beneath them, and who at some point genuinely integrated that restlessness, learned to hold it without being driven by it, and arrived at a kind of ease, can still be moved. They can still receive information about themselves that they didn't already have. They can sit with genuine uncertainty without the urgency to resolve it. Their stability is the stability of something that grew. It was not produced by narrowing the available territory until nothing destabilizing could reach the center. The rigidity arrives through an accumulation of small closures. Each time a potentially disturbing perception about the self was redirected rather than held, the boundary of what the self could receive without defending
contracted slightly. Each time an experience that didn't fit the existing account of the person was filed under some category that made it manageable rather than meaningful, the account became slightly more fixed. The process is not dramatic. It does not feel like the self becoming smaller. It feels like the self becoming more defined, more precise, more consistent, more coherent in how it presents to itself and to others. Definition feels like accomplishment. The fact that definition and rigidity can be the same thing, experienced differently depending on what generated them, is genuinely difficult to hold. You might notice it in someone when they encounter genuine disagreement. The settled person can hold the disagreement, sit with it, find it interesting, update if something real was offered. The rigid person returns to their original position with the same words, slightly louder, slightly more assured, as though the disagreement itself were evidence that something was wrong with the person disagreeing. What reads as confidence is a closed loop. The position is not being defended against a better argument. It is being defended against the possibility that argument could change anything at all.
The question that follows from this is not comfortable. If you have been experiencing yourself as stable, as someone who has done the work, moved through the difficult earlier periods, and arrived somewhere, how would you know which kind of stability you are living in? The surface feeling offers no guidance. The daily experience of yourself as someone who has arrived offers no guidance. The only information comes from what happens when something genuinely new appears. Whether you can receive it, whether it can actually reach you, or whether there is a system in place, unrecognized, experienced as simply how you are, that roots it into something manageable before it can do what new things need to do. This is part of what makes growing up without losing yourself so genuinely difficult as a project. The loss is not usually felt as loss at the moment of its occurrence. The closing of a once open territory inside the self registers as maturation. The point at which genuine flexibility hardened into defended stillness was experienced, at the time, as consolidation. The person who can no longer truly change believes they have simply become who they are. The language for both is identical. The experience of both, at the moment of living it, is indistinguishable. And the cost of the misidentification accrues silently, without ledger, without announcement, through the steady reduction of what a life can actually receive. Maturity does not happen to a person alone. This is one of those things that sounds obvious when stated plainly, and yet is consistently treated as though it were optional, as though the development of a self were something that could be completed in sufficient solitude, through enough introspection, through the right quality of attention turned inward. The interior work matters. It is real and necessary. But it remains incomplete in isolation in a way that has specific, observable consequences for the kind of person that isolation produces. The reason is structural. The self that is never genuinely tested by contact with another person who refuses to simply accommodate it stays partially theoretical. It knows itself only under controlled conditions, in the situations it has already encountered, in the emotional registers it has already mapped, in the responses it has rehearsed sufficiently to deliver with some fluency. What it has never been asked to do is hold its version of itself against someone else's genuinely different reality. Someone who sees the world in ways that don't confirm the picture the self has constructed, who needs things that the self did not anticipate needing to give, who remains stubbornly, persistently present as something other than a surface on which to project a preferred understanding. The problem is not a lack of willingness to know oneself. It is that certain things about a person only become visible under conditions of genuine contact. A person can spend years in careful examination of their inner life
and still not know how they actually respond under sustained pressure from someone they love, how they handle the experience of disappointing someone in a way that cannot be repaired quickly, what they are really like when they are frightened and someone else is watching. These are not things that introspection reveals. They are things that only sustained, honest relationship reveals, and only if the relationship is allowed to be genuinely demanding rather than curated into comfort.
What this means is that other people are not the audience for a self that is developed elsewhere. They are the condition under which certain dimensions of the self become available at all. Growth of a particular kind, the kind that has to do with knowing how to hold oneself in relation to genuine otherness, with developing the capacity to be changed by contact without being dissolved by it, requires the friction of an actual encounter. Something in the person must be pressed against something real in another person. The pressing is not pleasant. It is not designed to be. It is the process through which what is merely believed about the self gets separated from what is actually true. A person in a long relationship with someone who takes them seriously, not someone who mirrors their preferences back at them, but someone who refuses to let them remain entirely comfortable in their most convenient self-presentation, will be required to revise their account of themselves repeatedly. Not because the account is wrong in some global sense, but because the account was constructed under conditions that didn't include this particular person, this particular demand, this particular moment of being genuinely seen doing something they would not have chosen to be seen doing. The revision is not the loss of the self. It is the self becoming more accurate about its actual contents. This is different from the kind of change that happens when a person simply adapts to another person's expectations, when the relationship operates as a pressure toward conformity rather than a pressure toward honesty. The conforming self is not more developed for having spent years adjusting. It is, in many cases, less developed, because what was compressed in the adjustment was the material that most needed examination. The development that comes through genuine contact requires the other person to actually be encountered, which means allowing them to be genuinely different, genuinely demanding, genuinely capable of being disappointed by who you actually are rather than who you are performing. You may have experienced this in the form of a particular kind of discomfort that certain close relationships produce. The discomfort of being known with some accuracy, and having that knowledge occasionally reflected back at you in ways you did not invite and cannot easily dismiss. That discomfort is not evidence that something is wrong with the relationship. It is evidence that something real is happening. The absence of that discomfort is not evidence that a relationship is working well. It may be evidence that both people have reached an arrangement in which the most difficult material is mutually protected from contact. The specific quality of the person who can genuinely function as this kind of medium for someone else's development is not about therapeutic skill or particular generosity. It is about the capacity to stay present with someone while remaining honest, to refuse the small accommodations that make a relationship easier but less real. Most relationships drift toward the management of comfort over time. The management is not cynical. It is produced by the same pressure that shapes most of adult life. The preference for stability, the cost of conflict, the reasonable desire to be with someone without the relationship feeling like sustained effort. The drift is normal. What it forecloses is the continued developmental pressure that genuine contact would otherwise provide. This produces one of the more uncomfortable implications of what it actually means to grow up. The people who challenged your account of yourself, who refused to simply accept your preferred self-presentation, who required you to encounter yourself through their resistance, may have been experienced as difficult, as demanding, as sources of friction rather than support. The ones who were easiest to be with, who never pressed, who accommodated without complicating,
may have been experienced as the relationships that felt most comfortable. Comfort is real. The value of ease is real. And yet the developmental work, the work that actually moved something that needed to be moved, was more likely occurring in the friction than in the accommodation. The limit of this principle is real and worth holding. Sustained friction without genuine warmth is not development, it is erosion. A relationship that presses against the self without also holding it is not producing growth. It is producing a self that is increasingly organized around surviving the pressure. The distinction between a relationship that challenges honestly and one that simply destabilizes is not always obvious from inside it, and mistaking one for the other produces its own particular kind of damage. The friction that genuinely develops something is friction within a context of actual care, of being seen with some accuracy and held with some warmth simultaneously, which is perhaps the most difficult thing any sustained relationship is asked to provide. What remains unsettled in all of this is the question of how much of the self is genuinely changed by these encounters and how much of it reasserts itself once the pressure is removed. The development that happens through contact is real. Whether it persists, whether it reorganizes the self at a level deep enough to hold when the other person is not present, is the question that contact alone cannot answer. Something in the encounter changes the self. Whether that change becomes structure depends on whether it was received with enough depth to leave actual ground, or whether it was processed at the surface and allowed to pass through without altering what was already established below. There is a cost to maintaining a face of competence that is not paid all at once. It is paid in small installments, spread across years, rarely connected to its source, rarely identified as a cost at all. What accumulates is a gap between the version of yourself that you present to the world as coherent, resolved, and capable, and the interior life that does not match that presentation. The gap is not unusual. Most people carry something like it. What is less commonly examined is what the gap itself does over time, as a psychological fact in its own right. The mechanism begins simply enough. Some experience arises, doubt about a decision, fear that something is falling apart, an awareness that you do not know what you are doing in a situation where you are expected to know. And the social context makes expressing that experience costly. The cost might be professional, it might be relational, it might simply be the particular shame of being seen as less than you have established yourself to be. So the experience is contained, not in the sense of being held and metabolized, but in the sense of being held back. The presentation continues. The interior settles into something that does not match the surface, and life moves forward.
This, done once, is ordinary and often necessary. The question of what growing up actually requires does not hinge on a single moment of managed presentation. What matters is what happens when the management becomes the default, when the distance between inner experience and outer expression is no longer a conscious choice made in a specific context, but a persistent condition of how a person moves through their life. The gap widens through repetition. Every time the interior is held back, the distance between it and the presented self increases slightly. Over years, the interior can become genuinely remote, not because it is less real, but because the habit of not bringing it forward has calcified into something that no longer feels like habit. It feels like the natural structure of how you exist in the world. You speak in the register of someone who has things handled, because that register has been used so long that accessing another one feels strange, even in private. There is something particularly quiet about how this progresses. It does not announce itself as a problem. It is compatible with functioning at a high level, with being genuinely useful to others,
with producing real work and maintaining real relationships. The person carrying the gap does not necessarily feel like they are performing, because by a certain point, the performance is not experienced as separate from the self. It has been inhabited long enough to feel like identity. The cost shows up elsewhere, in a kind of tiredness that sleep does not resolve, in a difficulty accessing genuine feeling in situations that would seem to call for it, in the experience of being present in your life without quite being in it. What the gap does to the interior life is gradually undermine its availability. The feelings and perceptions that are consistently held back do not simply wait patiently. They lose some of their legibility. A person who has spent years not speaking about what is actually happening inside them may eventually find that they cannot locate it clearly when they try. Not because it is gone, but because the practice of suppression has disrupted the very processes through which inner experience is recognized and named. The contact with one's own interior becomes unreliable. You reach for what you actually feel and encounter something approximating it rather than the thing itself.
This is where the psychological cost becomes structural rather than merely inconvenient. The self that cannot clearly access its own experience begins to make decisions using incomplete information about its own state. It evaluates situations through a perceptual system that has been calibrated to filter before registering. What presents as clear judgment may be judgment that has already removed from consideration everything that would have been inconvenient to show. And you may not notice this in yourself because the filtering is efficient. It does not feel like removal. It feels like having a clear head. The social dimension of the gap adds pressure in a different direction. The competent, resolved presentation generates expectations in others that then become their own kind of constraint. They bring you certain things and not others. They rely on you in specific ways that assume the presentation is accurate. The longer the presentation holds, the more a person becomes surrounded by a social reality that is shaped by the gap, a reality in which the people closest to them have learned to interact with the version that is presented rather than the person who exists beneath it. Correcting this does not require anything dramatic, but it requires something, some act of letting the interior surface, which feels, after sufficient time, like a kind of exposure. The gap is maintained partly because revealing it would require renegotiating a social reality that was built around its absence. What makes this particular dynamic so persistent is that it is not recognized as suffering. It is recognized as adulthood, the capacity to manage what you show, to be appropriately contained, professionally reliable, relationally steady, is precisely what adult competence is understood to be. The gap is not a deviation from maturity, as most people use the word. For many people, it is maturity's central feature. The problem is that what has been described as grown-up behavior is, in many cases, the accumulation of unexamined interior pressure held behind a face that has learned to show only what is welcome. This does not resolve cleanly. The presented self is not entirely false. It represents real capacities, real commitments, real ways of moving through the world that are genuinely the person's own. But it is partial. And the part that is missing from the surface does not become irrelevant by virtue of being kept from view. It becomes the silent architecture beneath everything else, shaping responses, generating fatigue, producing a vague sense that something in the account of your life is slightly off without any obvious source for that feeling. The person who carries the gap for long enough may eventually find it difficult to remember what they were holding back in the first place, or whether there was ever a version of themselves that did not operate this way. That forgetting is not the same as resolution. It is the gap becoming invisible to its own carrier.
There is a version of honesty that presents itself as virtue and causes genuine harm. Not theatrical harm, not the kind that can be explained away as other people's discomfort with truth. Actual, specific damage to a person who trusted you, to a situation that required steadiness, to a relationship that could not absorb the full weight of what was true in that moment. And when you are the person who chose to speak that truth, or are the person who held it back, the question of which choice was the more mature one does not answer itself cleanly. The tension between what is authentic and what is responsible is real. It is not a misunderstanding to be corrected. It is a structural feature of adult life that most frameworks for thinking about psychological development quietly avoid. Authenticity, as a value, carries enormous cultural prestige. The instruction to be honest about your interior state, to express rather than suppress, to close the gap between what you feel and what you show. All of this operates as though expression were straightforwardly liberating and concealment was straightforwardly a form of self-betrayal. There is something true in this. The underground life described by the long habit of managed presentation carries real costs. The inability to access one's own experience clearly, the fatigue of maintaining a face that does not match what is beneath it. These are real consequences of a particular kind of suppression. The case for expression, for honesty, for letting the interior surface, is not without genuine weight. And yet, a person sitting across from someone who is frightened, who needs something specific from them in that moment, who is holding together a situation that is genuinely precarious. This person may have access to their own interior state that is entirely real and entirely beside the point. What they feel matters. It does not follow that expressing it will help. In fact, the expression may redistribute weight in a way that collapses the thing that needed to be held. Speaking the full truth of your own fear to someone who is depending on your steadiness is not, in that moment, a form of maturity. It is a form of accuracy that has mistaken itself for responsibility. This is where the conflict between authenticity and what growing up actually demands becomes visible as something more than a scheduling problem, more than a question of when and where to be honest. The conflict goes deeper than timing. It points toward the possibility that some forms of self-expression are genuinely incompatible with some forms of care. Not sometimes, not in extremity, but as a recurring feature of adult life with other people. The self that insists on its own expression in all contexts has not resolved a tension. It has simply weighted the scale in one direction.
Someone carrying a long grief, say, the slow recognition that a relationship they built over many years has become something neither person would have chosen, may have access to the full shape of that grief, and may understand with some clarity that speaking it aloud would require the other person to receive something they are not currently able to receive. The grief is real. The restraint is also real. Both are happening simultaneously in the same person. Which of them is more authentic? Which one represents what this person actually is? The answer to both questions is both. The person who feels the grief and the person who judges when to speak it are the same person, exercising different capacities that are both genuinely theirs. What the frameworks that celebrate authenticity tend to understate is that judgment, the capacity to assess what a moment requires and to calibrate one's expression accordingly, is itself a feature of a developed self. It is not a betrayal of that self. The editing of expression is not always suppression. Sometimes it is the exercise of a faculty that took years to develop, a faculty that knows the difference between what is true and what is needed,
and holds both without treating the tension as a problem to be solved by simply releasing one of them. The complication is that this capacity for calibrated restraint can be corrupted. It can become the cover story for permanent concealment, for the management of discomfort under the label of care. A person who never speaks what is true, because they have convinced themselves that the moment is never right, has not developed mature judgment. They have developed an elaborate rationalization for a gap that is growing wider with each silent decision. The restraint that is genuinely in service of another person looks very different from the restraint that is in service of one's own avoidance, and from the inside, they can be extremely difficult to tell apart. This is where the conflict becomes most uncomfortable, because the only reliable guide to which kind of restraint you are practicing is your own interior. The very interior that years of managed presentation may have made partially inaccessible. You reach for the honest assessment of your own motive, and what you find may be the real thing, or maybe a version of it that has been shaped by long practice in showing what is acceptable. The self-knowledge required to distinguish principled restraint from habitual concealment is precisely the kind of self-knowledge that the performance gap described in the previous section steadily erodes. There is no resolution to this that does not require living inside the difficulty rather than finding the correct answer to it. The conflict between authenticity and what genuine care sometimes demands does not produce a rule. It produces a recurring situation in which judgment is required, imperfect, potentially mistaken judgment, made with incomplete access to one's own motives, made in real time under conditions that do not wait. You will get this wrong sometimes. You will hold back something that should have been said, and the silence will leave something unresolved that compacted over time into distance. You will also, on other occasions, speak the full truth of what you are carrying, and the speaking will cost the other person something they could not afford to lose in that moment. The micro-moment in which the decision is made, speak or hold, now or later, fully or partially, is one of the least examined and most consequential units of adult psychological life. It happens dozens of times across a week, usually without being recognized as a decision at all. By the time you notice it, the choice has already been made, in the body, in the timing of a breath, in the way you move the conversation forward or let it rest. What this means for what growing up actually is, for what the word describes when it describes something real, is that development cannot be characterized as simply becoming more honest or more expressive or more fully in contact with your own experience. Those are partial descriptions of partial goods. Development includes the capacity to tolerate the unresolved tension between what you authentically carry and what the situation genuinely requires of you, to hold both without collapsing either one, and to act from inside that tension rather than escaping it by declaring one side more important. That tolerance is not comfortable. It is not the kind of thing that feels like growth while you are in it. It feels like being caught between two things that are both true, with no position available that resolves the catch.
The stopping is rarely loud. There is no announcement, no obvious threshold crossed, no morning on which you wake and recognize that something in the process of becoming has gone quiet. The developmental arrest that causes the most lasting damage arrives without the drama that would make it legible. It arrives as an ordinary Tuesday. It arrives as the unremarkable feeling of having handled the day. It arrives wearing the face of everything being more or less fine. What closes first is usually the questioning. Not all questioning. The practical kind continues, the planning and the problem-solving and the weighing of options that adult life requires in abundance. What closes is the other kind, the questions that do not have immediate answers, that point inward rather than outward,
that ask not what should be done next, but whether the life being built is the life that was actually intended. These questions are expensive to carry. They do not resolve on a timeline that fits between obligations. And so, gradually, they are set aside. Once, then again, then often enough that the setting aside begins to feel like resolution. The questions are gone, and their absence feels like peace. This is the mechanism that makes the quiet stopping so difficult to recognize from the inside. Stagnation does not produce a distinct negative sensation. It produces the absence of a certain kind of discomfort, the discomfort of genuine uncertainty, of not yet knowing, of being in the middle of something that has not yet arrived at its form. When that discomfort disappears, the most natural interpretation is that you have arrived somewhere, that the work of certain questions has been completed, that this is what it feels like to have grown past the stage of needing to ask them. The psychological cost is not immediate. A person can operate for years, competently, relationally, productively, after the internal questioning has gone quiet, without any obvious sign that something has narrowed. The narrowing shows up in texture rather than in function. Fewer things provoke genuine curiosity. The range of emotional response available in a given situation compresses slightly. New ideas land with less resonance than they once did, not because they are less interesting, but because the part of you that would have been interested has had less exercise. Ambiguity, which once felt like an invitation to think more carefully, begins to feel like a problem to be resolved rather than a condition to be inhabited. The person is still there, still capable, still present. But the perimeter of what they can tolerate not knowing has drawn inward, quietly, over time.
A person who has spent a decade not asking what they actually want, in work, in relationship, in the daily texture of how life is constructed, may find, if they suddenly try to ask, that the question does not return a clear answer. The silence on the other side is not restful. It is the specific silence of a capacity that has atrophied. The reaching inward that used to produce something, not certainty, but contact with something recognizably one's own, now produces a kind of blankness that is disorienting precisely because it is so unfamiliar. You thought the question was there, waiting. It turns out the questioning itself requires maintenance. Left unused long enough, it does not disappear exactly, but locating it becomes work that had not previously been necessary. Growing up, in the cultural imagination, points in the direction of increasing clarity. You become more certain of who you are, more settled in what you value, more capable of knowing your own mind without extended deliberation. Some of this is real and represents genuine development. But the version of clarity that results from stopping the questions is a different thing. It is the clarity of a field that is no longer being disturbed, which is also the clarity of a field that is no longer growing. The questions that feel most inconvenient, the ones that arrive in the middle of the night and implicate decisions already made and a life already substantially built, are not symptoms of immaturity. They are signs that the process is still alive. What makes the gradual narrowing especially consequential is its relationship to time. A crisis of development, a sudden recognition that something has gone wrong in how you have been living, has urgency built into it. It demands response. The quiet arrest carries no such urgency. It presents no clear problem to be solved. And because it does not present itself as a problem, the years it occupies are spent in the ordinary life of an adult who is, by every available measure, doing adequately. It is only from a later vantage point, and sometimes never, that the question of what was lost in that long adequacy becomes visible. By then,
A significant portion of the available time for a life has passed inside a narrowing that was mistaken throughout for stability.
This connects the quiet stopping to something larger than individual experience, to the question of what it means to arrive at genuine development rather than simply at the management of its appearance. The person who has stopped asking has not necessarily stopped changing. Circumstances continue to reshape behavior and preference and habit, but they have stopped participating consciously in the process of becoming what they are. They have become, in a specific sense, passengers in a life that continues moving without their active navigation. The motion continues. The choice to be in motion, rather than simply carried, has been quietly abdicated. You can feel the difference if you look for it. There is a quality to genuine engagement with your own life, even when that engagement is uncomfortable, even when it surfaces things that complicate the existing account of who you are, that is distinct from the experience of moving through a life whose shape has been fixed. The latter is not without pleasure or meaning. It can contain real warmth, real satisfaction, real moments of genuine presence. What it lacks is the particular aliveness that accompanies the recognition that the self is still in process, still capable of surprise about what it contains, still encountering its own edges. The absence of that aliveness is not always noticed. When it is, it tends to arrive not as a dramatic realization, but as a question with no obvious source, arriving quietly in the middle of something otherwise unremarkable. The question itself is the signal. What matters is whether anyone is still there to hear it. There is a particular kind of person who handles contradiction by making it disappear, not by solving it. That would require sitting inside the discomfort long enough to understand what the two sides are actually asking of each other. Rather, by deciding that one side is more important, more rational, more mature, and then constructing a life organized around that decision. The contradiction does not go away. It simply gets assigned to the category of things that have been dealt with. And, for a while, sometimes for a very long time, this works. The person moves through their life with the feeling of coherence that comes from having chosen a direction. What they lose is something harder to name, the capacity to be genuinely uncertain about themselves, to not yet know, to hold the two real things at once without forcing one of them out.
The structural capacity to live inside contradiction is one of the least glamorous and most consistently underestimated features of what growing into a developed person actually requires. It is not dramatic. It does not produce the kind of clarity that makes a good story. It produces the quiet, ongoing experience of being someone who can contain more than one true thing at the same time, and who does not mistake that containment for confusion or for failure to have resolved something that needed resolving. Consider what this costs. A person who has decided at some point in their adult life that they are practical rather than emotional, or committed rather than restless, or independent rather than needing, has not resolved an inner division. They have subordinated one part of themselves to a simpler account of who they are. The simpler account functions, it is legible to others, it allows for consistent behavior and coherent self-presentation. But the part that was excluded does not stop existing simply because it has been excluded from the official version. It continues operating underneath the declared identity, showing up sideways, in reactions that seem disproportionate, in a recurring fatigue that has no obvious cause, in the specific shape of what irritates most reliably. The coherence that was purchased through the exclusion is real. So is the cost. Genuine maturity, the kind that has actually developed,
rather than the kind that has been performed long enough to feel internal. Does not resolve contradiction by elimination. It develops the capacity to acknowledge that certain contradictions are not problems with one's thinking. They are features of being a particular kind of creature, living in time, in relationship, inside a life that cannot be made fully consistent with itself. You are someone who wants solitude and someone who needs connection. You are someone who values honesty and someone who understands that honesty has limits. You are someone committed to what you have chosen and someone who, on certain mornings, is aware that you might have chosen otherwise. None of these pairings is a sign that you have not yet figured yourself out. They are what a real self looks like, from the inside, when it is not being edited down to its most defensible outline. The pressure to choose a side is continuous and comes from several directions at once. It comes from the practical demands of daily life, which require consistent behavior and legible preference. It comes from other people, who are generally more comfortable with a version of you that is knowable and stable. It comes from yourself, from the fatigue of living in suspension, from the genuine exhaustion of not yet having a final answer to a question that keeps reasserting itself. The path of least internal resistance is always toward resolution, toward the settled account, toward the declared position. That path is understandable. It is also where something quietly dies. What dies is not the contradiction itself. The contradiction survives regardless of what position you declare. Because contradiction, when it is genuine rather than merely unexamined, is doing something. It is pressing on the edges of an existing understanding and asking whether that understanding is large enough to contain what is true. The person who remains in contact with their contradiction is someone whose understanding is still capable of expanding. The person who has declared the contradiction resolved has, in that moment, installed a ceiling on what they are able to think about themselves. The psychological term for the capacity to hold opposing trualities simultaneously, without premature resolution, is sometimes called integrative complexity, and it tends to correlate with what people who study development across the lifespan describe as psychological maturity. It is not a comfortable capacity to develop. It requires something more than intelligence. It requires the tolerance for not having a clean account of oneself, the willingness to remain somewhat opaque to oneself, to not yet be finished as a self-understanding project. This tolerance is not the same as passivity. It is an active orientation, maintained against persistent pressure in the other direction. The limit of this principle is worth acknowledging. Living inside contradiction indefinitely, as an end in itself, is not development. It can become its own form of stagnation. The person who refuses all resolution as a matter of principle, who has made ambivalence into a permanent posture, who uses the language of complexity to avoid the discomfort of genuine commitment. The structural capacity to hold contradictions does not mean treating all contradictions as equally unresolvable. Some things do become clearer over time. Some tensions do resolve, through experience, through grief, through the slow accumulation of evidence about who you actually are and what you actually value. The capacity being described here is not the refusal of resolution. It is the refusal to manufacture it before it has genuinely arrived. This distinction between resolution that has been earned and resolution that has been imposed is one of the harder ones to maintain in practice because both feel similar from the inside. A conclusion you have actually arrived at through sustained encounter with difficulty, and a conclusion you have adopted to relieve the pressure of not knowing, can produce the same sensation of settledness. The difference shows up over time in whether the settled feeling remains robust when the underlying question is disturbed or whether it requires a certain amount of ongoing avoidance to be maintained. A genuine resolution can withstand being revisited. An imposed one cannot afford to be examined too closely. Growing up, if it means anything more than the accumulation of obligations and the performance of capability, includes the development of this particular tolerance, the ability to remain present to the full complexity of what you are, without requiring yourself to be more coherent than a human life actually permits. That tolerance does not arrive automatically with age. It has to be cultivated, and the cultivation is uncomfortable, and there are no reliable external signs that it is happening. The person developing it looks, from outside, much the same as the person who has simply stopped questioning. The difference lives entirely in the interior, in whether the complexity is being held or whether the appearance of settledness is costing something that has not been accounted for yet.
There is a cultural demand that arrives so early and persists so consistently that most people never notice it as a demand at all. It presents as common sense, as social literacy, as the basic courtesy of being legible to other people. The demand is this: become coherent, become consistent, become the kind of person who can be known without too much additional effort on the part of those who know you. Resolve your contradictions, settle your direction, fix your edges into something that can be recognized reliably from one encounter to the next. This is presented as the natural outcome of growing up, as what a fully formed adult looks like. And it causes, in the people who take it seriously, a specific and largely invisible form of damage. The damage is not to function. People who have fulfilled this demand tend to function well. They are legible to colleagues and partners and institutions. They hold positions and maintain commitments and present a consistent account of themselves across contexts. The cost is paid elsewhere, in the narrowing of what they are able to remain genuinely open to, in the gradual foreclosure of directions that did not fit the declared version of who they are, in the slow disappearance of an interior life that was once more various and less resolved than the official self they have learned to inhabit. The person continues. The finished self continues. What diminishes is the distance between who they currently are and who they might still become. The pressure to appear finished is particularly acute in adulthood because there are real social rewards for settledness. People trust someone who seems to know their own mind. Institutions prefer employees who can be predicted. Relationships stabilize around a partner who does not regularly revise their account of what they want. These are genuine incentives, and they operate continuously in both large and small interactions. The person who responds to a direct question about their values or preferences with genuine uncertainty, who says honestly that they are still working something out, experiences, in many social contexts, a subtle lowering of regard. Uncertainty reads as immaturity. And so the performance of resolution begins, often years before any actual resolution has been earned. What makes this pattern consequential is the relationship between the performance and the inner state it obscures. A person who presents a finished self long enough will eventually begin to experience that self as real. The presentation becomes the interior. The declared resolution forecloses the actual questioning. And at the point when the questioning would have been most generative, when experience has accumulated enough to genuinely illuminate who a person is and what they actually value, the capacity for genuine inquiry has been suppressed into disuse. The self that was declared finished has become, in a functional sense, fixed, not because the work was done,
but because the habit of declaring it done was practiced long enough to become structural. The cost of a fixed self accumulates along a particular dimension, what it can receive. A self that is open, that is still in process, that acknowledges its own incompleteness, is capable of being genuinely changed by an encounter, by a piece of information, by a relationship, by an experience that does not fit the existing account. A self that has been declared finished receives all of this through a different filter. New experience is processed in terms of whether it confirms or threatens the established version. What confirms it is assimilated. What threatens it is categorized as aberration, as disturbance, as the kind of thing that should not be given too much weight. The person remains capable, competent, even insightful, but inside a range that has been quietly bounded. The world continues to offer material for growth. The finished self is no longer fully available to receive it. You may recognize this not as a dramatic turning point, but as something quieter, a sense that certain questions have been retired, that certain possibilities have been ruled out, not through examination, but through the accumulated weight of not revisiting them. The questions did not resolve, they were simply not returned to, and the not returning became permanent. The self that existed before those questions were retired was capable of a kind of motion, uncertain, sometimes uncomfortable, but genuinely generative, that the finished self is no longer able to produce. What replaced that motion was the feeling of having arrived. And the feeling of having arrived is one of the most convincing sensations that psychological life produces, regardless of whether the arrival corresponds to anything real.
There is something particularly consequential about the timing of this pressure. The demand for coherence tends to intensify precisely in the period when genuine developmental work is most necessary, in the decades of early and middle adulthood, when the cumulative experience of a life is finally sufficient to illuminate patterns that were invisible in youth. When the self is, in principle, best positioned to ask the questions that matter most about who it is and how it has been constructed. This is the period when culture is also most insistently telling you that those questions belong to an earlier stage, that the searching you are still doing is a sign of something unfinished that should have been resolved by now. The two things arrive simultaneously: the developmental readiness and the social instruction to stop developing. Many people follow the instruction. The self that stops at this point does not announce its stopping. It goes on generating experiences, forming opinions, maintaining relationships. It just does so within a perimeter that has been sealed rather than extended. The sealing is not noticed because the activity inside the perimeter continues without interruption. The loss is spatial rather than sensational. It is the loss of range, of the capacity to move into new territory, of the particular aliveness that accompanies genuine encounter with what is not yet known about oneself. This kind of loss does not produce grief automatically because it is not experienced as a loss. It is experienced as the ordinary texture of an adult life whose major questions have been addressed. The grief, when it arrives, and it does not always arrive, tends to arrive much later, and by then it is difficult to trace it back to the moment when the questions were quietly retired. The developmental damage caused by the pressure to be finished is not a sign of personal failure or weakness. The pressure is genuinely powerful, and the rewards for complying with it are genuinely real. What the framing of personal failure misses is the systemic nature of the demand. The degree to which the instruction to become coherent and legible is embedded in nearly every institution and relationship that shapes adult life. To recognize this is not to locate blame somewhere outside the self. The self participates actively in its own finishing, but the participation is rarely fully conscious,
and the consequences are rarely named clearly enough to be weighed.
What would it mean to resist the pressure without refusing the legitimate demands of adult life? The consistency, the reliability, the genuine commitments that sustained relationships and sustained work actually require. This is where the question does not have a clean answer. The resistance is not categorical, and it is not achieved once. It is more like a habit of returning, regularly, deliberately, to the recognition that the account of yourself you have been presenting is an account, and that accounts can be revised when the evidence warrants it, and that the willingness to revise is not the same as instability. It is closer to the opposite. The person who can revise their self-understanding when genuine revision is warranted is not someone who has failed to grow up. They are someone in whom the growing has not been arrested by the demand to appear finished before the finishing has actually occurred. There is a moment in late adulthood, sometimes early, sometimes decades in, when a person surveys what they believe and realizes they are not entirely sure when or how they came to believe it. The positions feel certain. They feel earned. They carry the weight of experience, of difficulty lived through, of conclusions arrived at after genuine cost. And yet, when you press on them, they do not yield. They do not bend under new evidence. They do not reconfigure in response to something that would have complicated them back when complication was still possible. They simply hold. And what holds in that way is not always integration. Sometimes it is calcification. The distinction matters enormously and almost never gets named. What genuine integration looks like in the people who have actually done the work is a kind of settled flexibility. A person whose conclusions have been tested enough that they can afford to be revisited, because revisiting them does not threaten the entire structure. The conclusions can be questioned because they were genuinely arrived at, and the process that produced them is still, in some form, available. A person in that state holds their understanding of themselves and the world with a grip that is firm enough to be functional and loose enough to change. They have been shaped by experience without being imprisoned by it. The shaping is visible, so is the ongoing motion. What calcification looks like is different. The conclusions have the same surface appearance. They are confident, articulated, consistent with a life that has been lived. But they have become load-bearing in a way that makes them untouchable. They are not held with a grip that could loosen. They are built into the architecture. To question them would not be to revise a belief. It would threaten the coherence of everything that was constructed around them, and so they are not questioned. They are reiterated. Every new experience passes through them and emerges confirming. Nothing new is actually received because the receiving mechanism has been reorganized to prevent disturbance. A woman in her late 50s once described something to a friend that is worth sitting with. She had spent 20 years certain that her difficulty in close relationships was a sign of her particular need for independence, an honest self-knowledge, hard-won, that she had organized her life around. Then, through a specific and unavoidable set of circumstances, she spent 6 months in genuine, sustained proximity to someone who simply refused to accept that account. Not through argument, through presence. And in that proximity, the certainty began to creak, not because the independence was false, but because it had been declared complete when it was still, in certain crucial ways, a cover story. The integration she had believed she'd achieved was real and partial. The part that was not integrated had been reclassified as settled. The creaking, when it comes, is diagnostic. A conclusion that has been genuinely integrated can sustain pressure. A calcified one cannot afford the pressure, and so generates a specific kind of internal resistance, not doubt, but something more like a preemptive foreclosure.
The subject changes. The conversation shifts. There is a quality of guardedness around certain territories that looks from outside like groundedness and is sometimes felt from inside as exactly that. The person who can no longer tell the difference between their groundedness and their guardedness has reached one of the less examined limits of adult psychological life.
The cause of this confusion is worth tracing. When a person has carried a conclusion for long enough, the conclusion and the person begin to merge. It is no longer a position they hold. It is part of how they are constituted. The psychological work required to revise it is not the work of reconsidering an argument. It is closer to the work of surgery on a self. And most people do not do that work voluntarily. They do it under pressure, or they do not do it at all. The mechanism by which calcification prevents revision is therefore not stupidity or bad faith. It is the ordinary operation of a self that has been constructed over time and is now engaged in maintaining its own continuity. The limit this creates is that the self can no longer receive information that would require it to change its most foundational structures. What looked like wisdom has become a defense. What makes this so difficult to navigate is that, from inside, integrated flexibility and calcified certainty are nearly impossible to tell apart. Both feel like having learned something. Both feel like the stability that comes after difficulty. Both produce the sensation of knowing where you stand. The difference is not in the sensation. It is in what happens when the position is genuinely tested. The integrated understanding flexes, the calcified one deflects, and the deflection is so smooth, so practiced, so automatic, that it rarely registers as deflection at all. It registers as good judgment, as discernment, as the earned capacity to recognize when something does not warrant your attention. You can sometimes locate the difference by noticing what irritates. Not the large frustrations, but the small, quick ones. The flash of annoyance when someone raises a question you thought you'd settled. The particular flatness that arrives when a conversation begins moving toward a territory that you have internally declared closed. Those reactions are information. They are the signal of a boundary that is not simply a preference, but a structural necessity. Something that cannot be approached too closely without triggering the defense. Genuine settledness does not produce that kind of irritation. It can engage with the territory without the territory becoming threatening. It is the calcified position that cannot afford to be revisited and produces, in the face of the attempt, a quiet but firm refusal. The lack of cultural language for this distinction is not accidental. Wisdom is one of the words a culture uses for its elders, and the implication of wisdom is that the conclusions it describes have been earned and can be trusted. To suggest that what presents as wisdom might be the hardening of an earlier position that stopped being questioned is to threaten something that a culture uses to organize itself, the sense that age produces perspective rather than merely producing the appearance of it. And so, the language for the distinction remains underdeveloped. There is no commonly available word for the moment when genuine development gives way to defended conclusion. There is no social vocabulary for asking, with genuine respect, whether what someone is expressing is insight or armor. What lives inside that absence is a question that applies to everyone who has been alive long enough to have formed strong convictions about who they are and how the world works. The question is not whether your conclusions are right. They may be entirely right. The question is whether they can still be reached, whether the path to them is still open, whether the process that produced them is still alive and available, whether encountering something genuinely new could still change them if the evidence warranted it.
A conclusion that cannot be reached cannot be revised, and a self whose foundational understandings are no longer reachable has not arrived. It has stopped. There is something underneath the accumulated shape of an adult life that did not arrive through learning or effort or the slow accumulation of experience. It was there before any of that, before the roles were assigned, before the adaptations began, before the long work of becoming someone that others could recognize and predict and rely upon. It was a specific quality, not a personality trait in the catalog sense, not an emotion, but something more like a mode of being present to the world, a particular angle of attention, a way of being arrested by certain things and indifferent to others that had nothing to do with what was socially rewarded or culturally legible. It was the person before the person learned to manage what they were.
That quality does not disappear. This is one of the things worth being precise about. It does not vanish in the course of growing up, does not evaporate under the sustained pressure of function and performance and role. It goes somewhere else. It goes down. And what lives at that depth is not available to ordinary recall, not the kind of recall that is simply a matter of deciding to remember. You cannot retrieve it by thinking about it. You cannot recover it by naming it. It is not a memory in the usual sense, even though it belongs entirely to your own history. It is more like a practice that has been suspended for so long that the muscles have atrophied, not destroyed, still there, but requiring something more systematic than intention to restore. This is what makes the recovery different in kind from nostalgia. Nostalgia is the feeling toward a past version of yourself, the warmth of looking back at something that no longer exists. Recovery is a different operation entirely. It is active and it is difficult, and it does not feel sentimental. Because what you are reaching toward is not a feeling about the past. It is a capacity that was real and functional, and that became inaccessible through disuse, through suppression, through the ordinary pressure of becoming an adult in a world that had specific and continuous requirements for what you were supposed to be. The sentimental version says, "I remember who I was, and it's beautiful, and I miss it." The excavation says, "Something was operating in me that I cannot currently access, and I need to find it, and the finding will require more than longing." What is being excavated is not innocence. The early self was not wise, was not balanced, was not fully capable of navigating adult complexity. The quality that needs recovering is not the whole of what you were at 7 or 11 or 15. It is specific, functional, and was always yours in a way that the adapted versions of yourself were not. Perhaps it was the particular way attention moved towards certain problems and stuck. Perhaps it was a register of feeling that got reclassified as inappropriate somewhere along the way and was gradually suppressed. Perhaps it was the capacity to be genuinely uncertain without that uncertainty producing anxiety. To be in a state of not knowing and find it generative rather than threatening. Whatever the specific form it took, it was yours before anyone else had much say in what you were supposed to be. The excavation is the attempt to recover it, not as a relic, but as a living resource. The difficulty of this recovery is partly cognitive and partly structural. The cognitive difficulty is that the adapted self has been operating for a long time and has developed its own account of who you are and what you are capable of. That account is not false. It contains real information. But it is also incomplete in ways that are not obvious from inside it, because the things it left out were left out gradually, each omission producing only a small shift in what the self presented to itself as its own nature. By the time the omission is large enough to be felt as absence, it is no longer traceable to a single moment of loss. It has become the background condition of a life, the slightly narrowed range of what seems possible, the slight dampening of certain kinds of response,
The steady sense that something is not quite as alive as it once was, without a clear account of when or how the aliveness diminished.
The structural difficulty is that excavation requires a willingness to be temporarily destabilized. The things that were buried did not go quietly. They went down because their presence was, at some point, costly, because the environment at the time could not accommodate them, or because the person could not afford to carry them openly, or because the role that needed to be inhabited had no space for what they expressed. Recovering them means bringing back something that was suppressed for a reason, and the work of distinguishing between a reason that was valid then and remains valid now versus a reason that was valid then and has long since ceased to apply, that is not a simple cognitive operation. It is something closer to a renegotiation with your own history. You may find traces of what needs recovering in the places where you feel a specific and otherwise inexplicable resistance. Not the general resistance of tiredness or irritation, but the particular quality of deflection that arises when something touches territory that was sealed rather than resolved. Or in the things you find yourself drawn to when no one is watching, and there is no social interpretation to manage. The particular quality of attention that emerges when function is temporarily suspended. These are not instructions for a method. They are the texture of what excavation actually feels like from inside, which is less like discovery and more like a slow, effortful returning of attention to things that were not forgotten so much as administratively set aside. The practice of growing up without losing yourself depends on whether this recovery is even attempted. And the attempt is not guaranteed by good intentions or by the general desire to know oneself better. It requires something more specific, a sustained willingness to tolerate the discomfort of encountering what was left behind without immediately reclassifying it as something that should stay behind. Because the first response to contact with buried material is often not recognition. It is resistance. The adapted self has become accustomed to its own shape, and what was excluded from that shape tends to register on first contact as foreign, as something belonging to an earlier and less adequate version of the person, rather than as a capacity that was real and was suppressed, and has never actually stopped being part of what you are. The recovery does not return you to something you once were. It cannot, and it should not. What it does, when it actually occurs, is introduce into the present self something that was continuous with the earliest version of you, something that survived the long adaptation without being destroyed by it, and that can now, under different conditions, operate again. The person who arrives at that point is not younger, they are more complete. And more complete is a different kind of maturity than the one that is produced by accumulation alone, by the simple addition of experience and role and function, and the performance of settledness over decades. It is the kind that requires at some point going back down before it becomes possible to go forward as something genuinely whole. The practice of returning is not a metaphor. It is a specific, recurring action, one that does not become easier with repetition and does not eventually resolve itself into a permanent state. What makes it a practice rather than an achievement is precisely that it cannot be completed once and then held. The conditions of adult life continuously produce drift, the roles accumulate, the performance of competence becomes habitual. The questions that were once alive begin to feel like questions that have been sufficiently addressed, even when they have only been set aside. And so, the return must happen again, and again after that. This is the problem with most accounts of what it means to develop psychologically as an adult. They describe a direction toward greater integration, greater self-knowledge, greater capacity to hold complexity, without adequately accounting for the force that works against that direction, constantly
and without announcement. It is not crisis that produces drift. Crisis tends to produce attention. What produces drift is the ordinary pressure of function, the continuous requirement to show up as a recognizable, reliable, manageable version of yourself across a sustained period of time. That requirement is not malicious. It serves real purposes, but it exerts a continuous pull away from the interior life and toward the presented one. And if the pull goes unnoticed long enough, the presented self begins to feel like the only one that exists. The criterion for whether returning is actually occurring is not whether you feel more peaceful or more certain. Those can be signs of genuine returning, or they can be signs of settling, of the comfortable narrowing that presents as resolution. The actual criterion is more uncomfortable. It is whether what you encounter when you turn inward resembles what you actually are, or whether you find instead a tidy account of what you have decided to be. The difference between those two is not always visible immediately. It requires something like pressure, the pressure of genuine attention held long enough to outlast the first organized response.
The mechanism by which returning is possible is related to something that was covered in thinking about excavation, the buried quality that the adapted self does not eliminate, but only suspends. Returning is not about recovering that quality once and then possessing it. It is about maintaining enough ongoing contact with it that it continues to operate. The contact is the practice, and the contact is interrupted constantly, not through failure of character, but through the simple fact that adult life has extensive competing demands on attention, and the interior life does not announce itself with urgency. It waits. It is always waiting. The question is only whether you turn toward it often enough that it does not become entirely foreign. What this requires in practice is a tolerance for what you find when you turn toward it, because what is there is not always comfortable. The interior life, when genuinely contacted rather than merely gestured toward, tends to contain things that the organized, functional self has decided not to carry openly. Feelings that were set aside not because they were resolved, but because there was no available space for them. Desires that were reclassified as unrealistic. Questions about the shape of a life that were declared answered before the answer was fully examined. Returning means encountering those things, without immediately recruiting them into a project of management, without quickly deciding what to do about them, without reorganizing them into something legible and functional before they have had the chance to simply be present. That restraint, the restraint of not immediately managing what is found, is one of the most genuinely difficult aspects of what maturity actually requires. The trained adult response to interior difficulty is problem-solving. Something is uncomfortable, so there is a next step, a reframe, a plan. The practice of returning requires suspending that response long enough to allow what is present to register fully, which is a different kind of discipline than anything produced by acquiring competence or accumulating experience. It is the discipline of remaining in contact with something that has not yet been resolved, without the contact itself becoming a form of performance. You have probably felt the difference, even if you have not named it. There is a quality of turning inward that is actually still an outward activity, a monitoring, a checking, a brief survey conducted efficiently so that the function of the day can resume. And there is a different quality, rarer, in which the turning actually goes somewhere, in which what is encountered is genuinely unfamiliar, not in the sense of being unknown, but in the sense of being alive, in a way that the organized surface of a day does not permit.
The first is maintenance. The second is the practice. And the two feel different enough when they occur that the difference is recognizable. The difficulty is that the first is much more compatible with the demands of a life, and so it tends to crowd out the second without any conscious decision to let it do so.
The question of whether maturity without self-loss is achievable hinges entirely on this. Not on whether a person has processed their history sufficiently, or developed adequate emotional vocabulary, or learned to take responsibility without resentment. All of those are real, and none of them are sufficient. The question is whether the practice of returning is maintained. Whether the person who has spent decades accumulating function and role and the capacity to be reliable still, with enough regularity, turns inward towards something that is not the accumulated function but the person underneath it. Whether that person is still reachable, whether the reaching is still happening. The practice does not look dramatic from outside. It rarely looks like anything at all. It is not a visible behavior or a social posture or a category that a culture has words for. It is something much quieter. The ongoing, imperfect, frequently interrupted attempt to remain in contact with what is actually happening inside you, even when what is happening does not fit the role you are currently occupying, even when naming it honestly would complicate the performance that the day requires, even when the simplest thing would be to let it pass unnoticed and resume the function. The attempt is made, or it is not made. And the cumulative result of whether it is made, across years and decades, is the difference between a person who arrives at the end of a long life, having grown, and a person who arrived somewhere much earlier and then, very efficiently, stopped. There is no final version of this. The practice does not conclude with a state of achieved integration that then maintains itself. The returning has to be repeated because the drift has to be corrected. And the drift is structural, produced not by weakness or failure, but by the nature of being alive inside a world that has continuous and specific requirements for what you are supposed to be and how you are supposed to appear. Maturity without self-loss is not a destination that can be reached and then inhabited. It is what the returning, done with enough honesty and enough regularity, makes possible. Not permanently, for now. And then again. The question that opened this long night was deceptively simple. Does growing up require losing yourself? And if it does, what exactly has been gained? It seemed at the start like a question with a shape, something to be moved through, examined from several angles, and then, at the right moment, answered. What became clear, over the course of moving through it, is that the question does not have that shape at all. It does not resolve. It transforms. What changes is not the answer, but the questioner. The person who asks whether the self survives the long pressure of a life is not asking the same thing at 40 as they were asking at 20, even if the words are identical. At 20, the question has the quality of a fear that the compromises demanded by adult life will slowly replace the original person with something more functional and less real. At 40, if the work of returning has been done with any honesty, the question becomes something different. It becomes a form of attention, a way of holding the whole of a life in view and asking not whether the self has survived intact, but whether what was most essential in it was carried forward or quietly abandoned. The person who began this journey, whoever they were before the adaptations began, before the roles were inhabited, before the performance of competence became habitual, that person is not recoverable as a finished object. You cannot return to them. The excavation that is possible and worth doing is not a return to an earlier version of yourself. It is the recovery of something that was continuous through all the versions.
the specific quality of attention or feeling or response that was yours before anyone else had much say in what you were supposed to be. That quality, if it has survived, is not nostalgia. It is the living thread that connects the person who began to the person who continues. And whether that thread is still present, still functioning, is one of the few things in adult psychological life that actually matters. There is a kind of maturity that is produced by accumulation alone, by the steady acquisition of experience, competence, and the capacity to function reliably across difficult circumstances. That maturity is real, and it is valuable, and it is not what this has been about. The maturity that is harder to achieve, and rarer, and less visible from the outside, is the kind that includes all of that accumulation without being reducible to it. The kind in which the person who has become capable and reliable and settled has also somehow remained reachable to themselves, to what is actually happening in them, to the questions they stopped asking at some point and need to ask again. The resemblance between the self who began and the self who arrives at genuine maturity is not a sign of arrested development. When something recognizable from the earliest version of a person is still present in the later one, not preserved as a relic, but alive as a functioning part of how they engage with the world, that is not evidence of something unfinished. It is evidence of something preserved against considerable pressure. The pressure to become a finished, legible, socially manageable version of a person is relentless and mostly invisible. And the fact that something from before that pressure can survive it intact is not childishness. It is the actual achievement. What has accumulated across this night, without ever quite landing as a conclusion, is something more like a shape. The shape of what genuine development actually requires, as distinct from what is socially recognized as development. It requires the capacity to hold emotion without eliminating it. It requires the capacity to grieve what must be lost fully, without pretending the loss is a lesson rather than a loss. It requires the ongoing practice of returning, not once, not as a dramatic act of self-recovery, but continuously, imperfectly, against the drift that is structural and never finally defeated. It requires the willingness to remain uncertain about certain things, long after the culture has decided you should be settled. And it requires, perhaps most of all, a tolerance for the discomfort of being genuinely present to your own interior life, even when that life does not fit the shape of the day. None of this is a checklist. It is a description of something that happens, or does not happen, in the background of an ordinary adult life, quietly and without announcement, over years and decades. The difference between a life in which it happens and a life in which it does not is not visible in any single moment. It accumulates. It becomes, eventually, the difference between a person who grew and a person who stopped growing at a comfortable point and then, very competently, stayed there.
The question of what maturity is does not close. What closes is this particular night of sitting with it. You have been here long enough that something, perhaps, has shifted, not into resolution, but into a slightly different relationship with the question itself. That is enough. That is, in fact, more than most of what is asked of a single night. Good night.